John Brown did nothing wrong.
Hallelujah, His truth is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true. He frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves the traitor crew. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
John Brown, the 19th century American abolitionist. He occupies a unique and continuous place in our nation's history. Few figures have embodied such a profound paradox. Hailed by some as a martyr, condemned by others as a terrorist, his legacy has inspired a wide range of individuals, from W.E.B. Du Bois to the Unabomber. His name continues to provoke intense debate and controversy, perhaps more so than any other American, past or present. As historian Cresquier Slaughter noted, quote, John Brown is still an enigma in many people's minds, end quote. For many, Brown's story is oversimplified as merely the raid on the federal armory and arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, culminating in the execution of Brown and his captured followers on the Virginia gallows, often taught in school as just one more event on the long road to the American Civil War. The title of this video essay will openly reflect my perspective on Brown. While I commit to maintaining scholarly integrity and authenticity in making my case, anything a student of history should do, I do admit to my opinion. To me, Brown exemplifies not only the finest ideological traditions that helped inspire the nation's founding, but also stands as a model of steadfast moral conviction, one that challenges us to confront the gap between our declared ideals and our lived realities. In short, to me, John Brown and his men are the Declaration of Independence made flesh and blood. This video will not attempt to provide a comprehensive biography of Brown's life or career, a subject deserving its own focus treatment and one you can find all over YouTube. Instead, this essay aims to argue why John Brown and his 6 raiders, 166 years after the fact, deserved posthumous pardons from the state of Virginia. Before we even begin, it is worth examining the long and often misdirected history of efforts to pardon John Brown. Over the decades, countless petitions, some national in scope, others the work of committed individuals, have sought to secure his exoneration, yet almost all have been directed at the wrong office, the President of the United States. This single fundamental error has doomed each attempt before it can even gain traction. Brown, after all, was not convicted under federal law. He was convicted under the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia. As such, the authority to grant him or any of his men a posthumous pardon lies solely with the governor of that state. The result has been more than a century and a half of well-intentioned but ultimately fruitless efforts, each one ending where they began, with no change to the record of conviction. Lastly, too many have seemingly forgotten that Brown did not go to the gallows alone. 6 young men, each with promising lives ahead, also perished in the effort to eradicate slavery in the United States. Only one effort in recent times has devoted both these major oversights, and I will link it below. For my money, it is the only current petition or campaign that is both active, encompassing, and accurate. If anyone feels sympathy at all for this idea, it takes all of 10 seconds to sign your name and maybe make history. The argument for a pardon are twofold, legal and moral. Let there be no confusion, whatever one thinks of Brown and his men. They did, in fact, raid Harper's Ferry with the express goal of liberating enslaved people, acts deemed illegal under Virginia law at the time. That fact is not in dispute. What is in dispute are the subsequent charges of murder and treason. I will address both angles in turn, as I believe the legal case is not only compelling, but far stronger than most would expect. But let's take it one at a time. The moral argument is simple. John Brown and his men gave their lives to end America's original sin. They used force to challenge an unredeemable, inherently violent institution, taking Sharp's rifles and pikes to fight the whip, the brand, and the chain. In the words of Frederick Douglass, Brown, quote, began the war that ended slavery. Pennsylvania State Senator Morrow B. Lurie, who had met a young Brown during his years in New Richmond, Pennsylvania, later declared in 1865 in similar terms that, quote, John Brown was the first martyr of this rebellion, end quote. But it goes deeper than that, especially when one considers the thousands of Confederates who were pardoned by the Johnson administration. Right, thousands pardoned, men who had taken up arms against the flag of the United States in hopes of forging a new nation with its cornerstone laid on human enslavement. And that was an irony not missed at the time. As one newspaper would put it, why was not John Brown allowed to take the oath? Suppose Massachusetts had seceded instead of South Carolina, and William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips had been the leaders of the rebellion. Everybody knows that nothing would have been said about taking the oath in such a case. The captured abolitionists would have been hung instanter. Moral: fighting for slavery is justifiable. Fighting for freedom is treason.
You promise us the vote, then sing us we shall overcome. Hey, but John Brown knew what freedom was, and he died to win us some. The movement's moving.
Now that was the moral case. Let's tackle the legal. The legal case demands a closer examination because few understand the actual course of his trial or the bizarre legal maneuvers that under scrutiny completely fall apart. Let's set the scene. John Brown, John Copeland, Barclay Copac, Aaron Stevens, and Shields Green, alias Emperor, are brought before the Charleston Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Richard Parker. Their trials mark the opening of a legal drama that both captivates and divides the nation. Meanwhile, two more of Brown's men, John Cook and Albert Hazlitt, are captured in Pennsylvania while trying to flee north. Cook, Brown's trusted spy and intelligence officer, is seized near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, after lingering in the area a bit too long. Hazlitt, traveling under the alias William Harrison, is caught soon afterwards as well, slowed down by horrific blisters on his feet. Both are expedited to Virginia. Cook's arrival on October 27th completes the grim roster of Brown's surviving raiders, all of whom would now face judgment in an openly hostile court. In fact, to call it hostile would be a bit of an understatement, as we will address later. Naturally, John Brown, the undisputed leader of the raid and an already nationally known figure from the violence in Bleeding Kansas, was the first to stand trial. Virginia was determined to convict the well-known abolitionist and his followers, refusing to surrender him or any of his men to federal authorities. They were charged with murder, treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, and inciting a slave insurrection. However, notably, Shields Green and John Copeland, both men of color, were charged only with murder and inciting a slave insurrection, a direct reflection of the court's racial bias and legal maneuvering. Under Virginia law, only American citizens could be charged with treason, and in the wake of the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which declared that black people, enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens, Green and Copeland were thus legally excluded from that count. Of all the charges, murder was by far the weakest against the surviving raiders. Nearly every man who could have been reasonably tied to an identified killing during the raid was already dead. Stuart Taylor, the young Canadian believed to have shot Hayward Shepherd on the Potomac Bridge, was killed in the fighting. Dangerfield Newby, the freedman desperately seeking to liberate his enslaved wife and children, was also slain. Watson Brown, too, died of wounds received inside the Harper's Ferry engine house. The only two surviving raiders credibly linked to a confirmed killing was Shields Green and Edwin Copac. Copac, a Quaker by upbringing, was, according to multiple contemporary accounts, responsible for firing the fatal shot that killed Fontaine Beckham, the mayor of Harper's Ferry. In my view, the burden of proof needed to connect the other 5 surviving raiders to murder, aside from perhaps Copac and Green, would have never stood in an unbiased court of law. And that leads to a larger point. The proceedings at Charleston were less of a trial and more of a kangaroo court. This is only the start of the issues with Brown and the Raiders' trials. For example, John Brown's first 2 court-appointed attorneys, Lawson Botts and Charles J. Faulkner, were both pro-slavery Virginians with no genuine intention of defending him. They were present only because the law required that a defendant have counsel. From the outset, it was clear that they had no interest in even mounting a token challenge to the prosecution's case. Tellingly, they did not even challenge the jury selection process, an admission that likely concealed rather than exposed the deeply politicized nature of the proceedings. In a trial so charged with sectional hatred, failing to question the impartiality of jurors was not merely negligence, it was compliance. And the initial prosecutor for the state of Virginia was equally as awful. As described by Reynolds, quote, "The state's prosecuting attorney, Charles B. Harding, was a bulky, bilious man with a hooked nose and several days' growth of scraggly beard on his receding chin. Often he would present an argument against Brown, sit down and put his feet on the table, and then doze off while the rest of the trial went on. Once he snored himself awake and cried out for tobacco. The bailiff rebuked him by saying, quote, 'Gentlemen must not talk in court,' end quote. Harding talked anyway. On the second day of the trial, he accounted for bruises on his face by telling of a fist fight he had the previous evening with a man he described as, quote, 'a blind N-word.' Impaired by alcohol, Harding lost track of his arguments and was eventually dismissed by the court. If that was not enough, the second appointed prosecutor was Andrew Hunter, none other than a relative of the slain Fontaine Beckham, who made no secret of his eagerness to prosecute on the behalf of his deceased kinsman, a conflict of interest to say the least. Brown would not receive a real defense attorney until after the trial had already begun, and only after Lawson Botts, against Brown's expressed wishes, pursued a feeble insanity plea. Brown's true and best attorneys, Hiram Griswold and George Hoyt, arrived later, but when they requested a short delay just to familiarize themselves with Virginia law and the facts of the case, Parker refused. With that denial, Brown's last legal safeguard was shut. The facts are clear. The court shortchanged Brown at every turn in order to rush him towards a preordained conclusion. It was a mockery of a trial. One of the very few in-depth studies on Brown's trial illustrates this and more, and it's John Brown's Trial by Brian McGinley. I would highly recommend it if you are into 19th century legalisms, and he literally makes every case I just made in a much more eloquent form. It is an amazing book, and I cannot highly recommend it more. Lastly, I would argue that if Virginia could pardon Gabriel Presser, the black man who had planned his own slave rebellion nearly 60 years prior to Harper's Ferry, they can finally do the same for Brown and his men. Well, that's my case. A pardon today would recognize that Brown and his men acted in the service to a cause now universally acknowledged as just. Their raid on Harper's Ferry was not a quest for personal gain, conquest, or tyranny, but a desperate blow against a system that had stripped millions of liberty, dignity, and humanity. They risked and ultimately gave their lives to spark a moral reckoning that the political process had failed to deliver. One may debate Brown's methods, but the justice of his cause is beyond dispute. To withhold a pardon is, in effect, to align with the laws and institutions that upheld slavery, rather than the principles of universal freedom. The continued presence of Brown and his men's convictions on the historical record is a lingering injustice, a vestige of a slaveholding legal order we claim to repudiate. A posthumous pardon would not erase history. It would but correct the moral and legal record, bringing it into alignment with the principles that the nation professes to honor today. While much, and I mean much, has been written about Brown, many famous quotes I could pull from, I will end this essay with one of my favorite underscores on Brown. And it's not from Thoreau, Redpath, Malcolm X, Du Bois, or even Garrison. It's one I feel particularly fitting for this subject and this point. And it's from the little-known biography of Brown by William Connolly in 1900. Quote, "John Brown perished on a scaffold of ignominy, in conforming to the exactions of recognized and accredited systems, and had an instance of reactionary institutions poisoning and drying up the fountains of our national life, and in doing so died a martyr for human liberty. Such men remain potent forces in individual and national life. They touch and quicken in men and nation truth, justice, patriotism. John Brown comes with a message to one and all today. If we can get to some correct comprehension of the motives by which his life was ordered, and the principles which led him to sacrifice himself for high and noble purposes, if we can apprehend why he sought the relief of the poor, the weak, the despised, rather than the pulpits of the rich, the mighty, the unjust, and that in doing so, but sought to bring us back to the truth and the simplicity of the fathers of our country, then we may profit by the important lessons his life holds for us." End quote. Thanks for
Owen
listening.
Brown was an abolitionist. John was Owen's son. He grew up in New England. He was born in Torrington. John Brown was a tanner and a man of many skills. He stood up for the workers who toiled in the mills. He stood up for the Indians. He stood up for the women, for the oppressed and the exploited. This good man stood with them. So when Kansas was bleeding, he went and joined the fray. If the slave trade wanted Kansas, the slave trade would have to pay. Riding on the Kansas prairie with a fine and loyal.
So they were probably like, that's not the guy to do it.
And he's a white guy or black guy?
He was a honky.
But his last name was Brown.
Yes.
So they give him some of that credit.
He gets a lot. He gets a lot of credit in the black community.
Does he really?
That's a great. Yeah, I mean, he was the man.